Sloane Whitmore walked into the restaurant with every intention of ending the blind date in 10 minutes. The man across from her wore a scuffed jacket and arrived in a pickup truck older than the parking attendant. Nothing like the heirs and executives her family kept arranging. She tested him with cold silence while the wealthy guests nearby traded quiet smirks. But when Caleb Rowan pushed back his chair and reached for his coat, Sloane set something on the table between them. A charred, cracked watch, and looked at him steadily. "You don't recognize me yet?" she asked. The entire room went still. If you want to know the secret connecting these two strangers across 12 years, stay with this story all the way to the very end. The house in the western suburbs of Chicago was modest by any measure. A two-story wood frame with a porch that needed new planks and a driveway just wide enough for one truck. Caleb Rowan had bought it the same year his daughter was born, back when his wife was still alive and a bigger mortgage felt like hope rather than risk. Now it was the kind of quiet that only settles into a home after years of keeping a tight circle, and on a Thursday evening in late October, that quiet was interrupted by his 15-year-old daughter standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and her expression set in the particular way that meant she had already decided something. Tessa had found the text from their neighbor Nora Bell, the one explaining that she had arranged a dinner, that the woman's name was Sloane, and that Nora described her as someone who needed to meet a person who wasn't trying to impress anyone. Caleb had been planning to cancel since noon, and Tessa knew it. She pointed out that he had eaten the same microwave pasta 3 nights in a row, that the last time he had left the house for something that wasn't work or groceries was her school play in March, and that she was 15, not 5, and did not need him home every single evening. He listened to all of it while pulling on his boots, which was how she knew she had already won. Caleb Rowan had never been a man who could argue against honesty delivered without cruelty, and his daughter had inherited precisely that quality from him. He told her not to wait up, and she told him she absolutely would. The jacket he wore was dark navy, and had been with him long enough to carry the faint smell of structural concrete and old leather, not expensive and not intended to be. He drove his 12-year-old pickup into the city and let the parking attendant look at the truck the way parking attendants at places like this always did, which was with a brief, controlled neutrality that said everything it needed to say. Caleb didn't hand over the keys with an apology or an explanation, and he didn't linger over the moment. He had a name, Sloane, and a reservation, and that was enough. What he didn't know, because Nora had deliberately kept the last name out of their conversation, was that Sloane was Sloane Whitmore, chief executive of Whitmore Crown Holdings, heir to a 3-generation real estate empire worth a number that most people encountered only in news headlines. She had spent the afternoon in a glass-walled conference room fielding pressure from her board about Riverglass Tower, a $1.8 billion development on the riverfront that was currently stalled because a structural safety report had flagged the smoke evacuation system as critically deficient. A board member named Grant Blackwell had spent 40 minutes insisting the report was overcautious and that the timeline could not afford another delay. Sloane had listened with the particular patience of someone who had been underestimated in conference rooms her entire career, and before leaving her office she told her assistant she would be gone no longer than 10 minutes for the dinner. She believed it when she said it. When she arrived at the restaurant and saw Caleb through the glass, the worn jacket, the unhurried posture of a man who hadn't dressed to perform, she confirmed what she had already decided, which was that Nora had arranged something that was not going to work, and that her 10 minutes had been generous. Sloane arrived 6 minutes late without acknowledging it, which was a test in itself. She had learned years ago that a man's first reaction to being made to wait told her more about him than any question she could ask. Caleb was standing when she reached the table, and he pulled her chair out with the kind of ease that wasn't performance, the way someone does something they were raised to do, rather than something they had rehearsed for an occasion. She sat. He sat, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and Caleb did not fill the silence with nervous chatter, which surprised her. She asked him, directly, whether he knew who she was. He said he knew her name was Sloane and that she was a friend of Nora's. She studied his face for the tell, the flicker of recognition being suppressed, the careful effort of a man pretending ignorance, and found nothing she could read as false, which annoyed her more than the expected transparency would have. She asked what he did. He described Rowan Structural Safety in plain terms, a consulting firm that assessed building systems, primarily smoke control, fire egress, and structural load distribution in high-rises. She asked how large the company was. He said small enough that he knew every employee by name and that this was a deliberate choice. When she pressed on the question of ambition, where he wanted the company to be in 5 years, he said his only professional ambition at the moment was accuracy, which she initially interpreted as an evasion before she considered the possibility that he meant it precisely. She asked whether he typically spent his evenings at restaurants like this one. He said typically no, and that he was fairly certain she hadn't either until she had a reason to own one in everything but name. Sloane recognized that as a perceptive observation delivered without any visible effort to make her feel flattered by it, and she filed it away without responding. Grant Blackwell was at a table across the room. With 4 investors, Sloane recognized from the Riverglass Funding Group, and she felt his attention settle on her from the moment she arrived, which she had grown accustomed to and had learned to ignore. What she could not ignore was when Grant stood and walked over with the ease of a man who considered any social space in the city to be his by right. He introduced Caleb to the table in a tone of amused generosity, describing him as Sloane's new friend from the ventilation trade, and the investors laughed the way people laugh when they are not entirely sure the joke is funny, but understand that laughing is the price of the table. One of them asked whether Caleb was aware that a single glass of wine at this establishment cost more than a half-day's labor in his field. Caleb ordered still water, told the server thank you, and said he made a general policy of not paying for things he didn't need. Not with particular sharpness, just as a statement of fact. Sloane did not laugh, but she didn't intervene either, and she registered the absence of her own intervention as something she would return to later. She continued pressing Caleb with questions about property, income, and whether he had attended the dinner with any expectation about what it might offer him beyond an evening out. He absorbed the questions without defensiveness and without performing humility. But somewhere in the 3rd or 4th exchange, he set down his menu with quiet deliberateness and told her that he had been under the impression this was a dinner, but it appeared to be an audit, and that he respected the need for one without particularly wanting to sit through it. He placed enough cash on the table to cover his portion and stood to collect his jacket. That was when the fire alarm sounded from the kitchen. It was not a fire. A heating element in the kitchen had overloaded and tripped the suppression panel, and the staff had it contained within 3 minutes. But the alarm itself sent a current through the dining room, and one of the young servers near the host stand went rigid. Her tray dropped, her breathing visibly wrong, short and rapid, and heading toward something worse. Caleb moved to her before anyone else had processed what was happening. He crouched to her level and spoke quietly, clearly, telling her to count 7 breaths, to look at him between each one, to take the next step when she was ready and not before. The young woman did exactly what he told her to do, and the rigidity in her shoulders eased by the 4th breath. She was functional before the alarm had been officially silenced. Sloane stood completely still across the room and did not hear the rest of the alarm, did not hear the manager's announcement that everything was under control, did not hear the sound of silverware resuming on porcelain. She heard the words, "Count 7 breaths, look at me, take the next step," in a room that was not this one. She was in a stairwell that smelled of burning plastic and electrical heat 12 years ago, in a hotel on the city's west side that had caught fire in the early hours of a November morning. She had been 25 and alone, and the smoke had come up faster than anyone expected, and she had been frozen on a landing between the fourth and fifth floors when a man came down from above with a flashlight and a voice that was absolutely steady, telling her to count 7 breaths, to look at him, to take the next step when she was ready. She had been registered at the hotel under her middle name, Lena, to avoid the attention that followed the Whitmore name during a period of public litigation involving the family trust. The man who helped her out had been wearing a volunteer rescue vest and moved like someone with training and no interest in recognition. After he had gotten her and 2 other guests out through a secondary exit, he had gone back in, and she had not seen him again that night. She had kept the watch, an old mechanical watch he had strapped to her wrist in the stairwell so she could follow the luminous hands and regulate her breathing, for 12 years, because it was the only physical proof she had that the event had happened exactly as she remembered it. She looked at the scar that ran along the inside of Caleb's left forearm, the kind of scar a burn leaves when it heals without proper attention. She had seen the same scar at that same angle as he held a door frame in the stairwell while the heat came through from the other side. When he returned to the table to collect his coat, she asked him his full name. He told her, Caleb James Rowan. She opened the small clutch bag she carried and placed the watch on the white tablecloth between them. The face cracked, the leather strap darkened and stiff. He looked at it without touching it. She looked at him and asked the question that had been waiting 12 years to be said out loud. "You don't recognize me yet?" He studied her face with the care of a man searching his own memory for something he knew was there. He said the name he remembered was Lena. She told him Lena was her middle name, one she had used during a period when the Whitmore name attracted a kind of attention she hadn't wanted. Grant Blackwell, still at his table with his investors, had heard every word, and his expression had shifted from amusement to something considerably more focused. Sloane did not look at him. She looked at Caleb, and in the quiet of the dining room she told him plainly, he had been the person who walked her out of the fire. Nora closed off the private dining section without being asked. She had read the room before Sloane had needed to say anything, and for a while it was only the 2 of them at the table, with the watch between them and the sounds of the main room muffled behind a partition. Sloane asked why he had never come forward after the fire, never contacted the Whitmore family, never indicated in any way that he knew who he had helped that night. Caleb said he hadn't known, and that even if he had, he wouldn't have. She pressed. He must have seen the coverage, must have recognized at some point the name of the family involved. He said that by the time the coverage ran he was working a site in Michigan and that he didn't follow society news as a matter of habit. He also said, with a directness that she recognized as genuine rather than calculated, that he had not pulled people out of buildings in order to keep a record of what he was owed. Sloane told him she had kept the watch because she needed to know that the act had been real, that there existed in the world at least one person who had helped her without knowing what she was worth. He absorbed this without responding immediately, and when he did respond, he said that it had been real, and that the watch had belonged to his father, and he was glad it had been kept. She said she wanted to return it, and also wanted to provide something substantial. She named a figure that would have cleared every remaining business debt of Rowan Structural Safety 3 times over, and she mentioned a private education fund for Tessa, and she mentioned several other things that people with that kind of money mentioned when they were trying to express gratitude in the only language they were fully fluent in. Caleb told her no. She had not been told no in that context before, and it took a moment to register. He explained, without condescension, that gratitude converted into payment had a way of making the recipient feel like a contractor, and that he preferred to be neither a creditor nor a charity case in someone else's story. Sloane felt the rejection of the offer in a way that surprised her, not as offense but as something closer to embarrassment, the particular embarrassment of having handed someone something that mattered to you and having them hand it back, not with cruelty, but with clarity. Grant appeared at the edge of the private section before either of them had fully settled into the new terrain of the conversation. He was polite in the visible way of a man who had practiced politeness as a professional tool, offering congratulations on a touching reunion before pivoting with practiced smoothness to the information that Whitmore Crown had recently received a formal assessment from a consulting firm named Rowan Structural Safety, a report that was currently the primary cause of the delays on the most significant development project the company had undertaken in a decade. Sloan stared at Grant and then at Caleb. Caleb said he had not known who the project belonged to before tonight, and that the assessment had been commissioned not by him but by the building's lead architect, who had reached out for an independent review. He told Sloan that if she wouldn't understand what the report said, she should read it herself rather than receive it through someone with an active financial interest in burying it. The reunion that had been, for a few minutes, something neither of them had expected, was already becoming something else entirely. The printed emails arrived at Sloan's office the following morning in a sealed envelope Grant delivered personally, and they were thorough in the way of fabrications built by someone who understood what thoroughness was supposed to look like. The messages, purportedly sent from a Rowan Structural Safety account over the previous 3 weeks, laid out a demand in graduated steps. First, a consulting fee substantially above market rate, then a direct equity stake in Riverglass Tower, then a seat in a newly created advisory position reporting to the CEO. The language in the emails was careful, not threatening but persistent, the kind of persistence that implied access to information the sender was willing to use. Grant presented them across Sloan's desk, with the expression of a man who was sorry to be the one doing it. She called Caleb and told him to come in. He arrived at the Whitmore Crown offices without a lawyer and without apparent anxiety, which she noted, men who were guilty generally either overcorrected into aggression or undercorrected into excessive calm. And Caleb's composure had a different texture, the kind that comes from simply having nothing to manufacture. He sat across from her in the main conference room with several of the company's senior directors present, which Grant had arranged, and he read the emails she placed in front of him with the focused attention of someone reviewing technical documentation. He said the signature formatting was wrong. He said the account identifier prefix didn't match the domain structure Rowan Structural Safety used. He asked to see the original server metadata from which the messages had been extracted. Grant said the security protocols of the document management system made that retrieval impossible in the current session. Caleb said he understood and looked at Sloan and said that was convenient. She asked him directly, would he withdraw the safety report? He said no. She asked why. He explained the specific failure mode, a pressure reversal in the evacuation ducting triggered by primary power loss, which would cause the fire doors on floors 17 through 31 to lock in the wrong orientation, blocking rather than clearing the egress paths. He said it wasn't a theoretical risk, it was a mechanical certainty based on the installed configuration, and that the installed configuration had been changed from the approved design at some point after the final inspection. Sloan told him she found it difficult to trust the analysis of someone who appeared to have coordinated this assessment with an awareness of who owned the building. Caleb said she could find it difficult to trust him. That was her right. But that load-bearing physics did not adjust themselves to match the preferences of anyone's corporate structure, including one with 100 years of history behind it. She held his gaze for a long moment, and then told him that Rowan Structural Safety's consulting engagement with Whitmore Crown was suspended pending investigation. Grant held a door open for the departing directors with the ease of a man who had just accomplished something significant without having done anything that could be directly attributed to him. Caleb gathered the printed emails into a neat stack, set them on the edge of the table, and said one thing before he left. He asked Grant to explain, in whatever future context he chose, why the building's duct routing design had been altered exactly 3 hours after the final city inspection had signed off. The launch event for Riverglass Tower was held on the 42nd floor in a space designed to look like the future of urban luxury. Floor-to-ceiling glass, catered from 3 separate kitchens. A guest list that read like a summary of Chicago Capitol. Grant had persuaded Sloan that announcing the opening date publicly would stabilize the investment group's confidence in the project, and that the safety concerns were still under internal review, and that the appropriate thing to do was project forward momentum rather than internal hesitation. Sloan had agreed, which she would later categorize as one of the cleaner examples of being correct about being wrong. Maris Holt, the project's lead architect, had sent Caleb a message 3 days before the event, explaining that the board intended to use the evening as an implicit endorsement of the project's safety status and that she believed someone with independent authority needed to be present. Caleb came. His name had been removed from the guest registry, but he arrived at the elevator with a copy of the technical assessment and told the security staff he was there to deliver documents to the engineering review board. Grant spotted him from across the room before the security question was resolved, and Grant made a decision that reflected his understanding of the situation with almost impressive precision. He decided to use Caleb's presence rather than remove it. He brought Caleb to the front of the room with the cheerful generosity of a man who believed he controlled every variable. He introduced him to the assembled investors, city officials, and journalists as the gentleman who had attempted to leverage a 12-year-old act of heroism, a burned watch, a smoke-filled stairwell, into an equity position in a billion-dollar development. He said it with warmth and with the practiced self-deprecation that made the joke seem like it was on everyone. And the room responded with the laughter that rooms like that one produce when a person with the right bearing says something at another person's expense. Someone near the back said something about a single parent looking for a shortcut, and the laughter continued. Sloan was standing near the east wall, and she heard all of it. The emails had done their work on her. She was still carrying the doubt they had planted, still looking at Caleb and seeing the possible outline of a man who had understood the value of what he possessed and had chosen to use it. She did not add her voice to the room, but she did not stop Grant either, and the absence of her intervention felt like its own kind of statement. Grant turned to her and asked, in front of the room, whether Caleb would agree to stay away from the project if he were compensated fairly for his trouble. Caleb was quiet for a duration that the room felt as long. Then he placed the burned watch on the presentation podium beside Grant's microphone and spoke clearly enough for the back of the room to hear without raising his voice. He said the woman in the hotel stairwell 12 years ago had trusted a stranger in smoke and darkness, and that the CEO of Whitmore Crown was apparently more willing to trust a printed sheet of paper than the person who had actually walked her out. He said he had been offered $3 million by Whitmore Crown's legal team 6 months earlier, which the room did not know, and had declined without asking for anything in exchange. He had not sought equity in the project, had not requested a title, had not positioned himself near Sloan with any intention beyond delivering a report he had been hired, independently, to produce. He then produced the formal termination of his consulting engagement, signed and dated, and placed it on the podium next to the watch. Without sentinel vent, he said, the building could not pass the fire egress certification required to legally occupy any floor above the 14th. Grant said there were other firms. Caleb said there were, and that sentinel vent was protected by 8 registered patents he had co-developed, and that any firm attempting to replicate it would be doing so in a legal environment he was prepared to defend vigorously. He walked out of the room without waiting for a response, and the sound his footsteps made on the stone floor was the only sound for several seconds after the door closed. Helena Whitmore was 72 years old and had spent 5 decades watching people try to tell her what the Whitmore family should do with its money its land, and its reputation, and she had developed over those decades a precise and unsentimental eye for the difference between a threat and a truth. She called Sloane into her study the evening after the launch event and did not offer tea or sit behind her desk. She stood by the window that looked out over the lake and said, without preamble, that she had watched the recording from the event and that she wanted to understand what Sloane had been thinking when she allowed Grant to humiliate a man Sloane's own file described as a person who had carried her out of a burning building. Sloane said the emails had made the situation unclear. Helena said the emails were a fabrication so obvious that a competent paralegal could have identified it before lunch, and that Sloane had not called in a competent paralegal because she had wanted them to be true. Sloane started to respond, and Helena continued. The first moment Sloane had seen Caleb Rowan's jacket, she had concluded what kind of person he was. And everything that followed had been her mind, searching for evidence to confirm the conclusion she had already reached. Grant had needed only to provide that evidence in a form she would not examine too closely, and she had accepted it because examining it too closely would have meant acknowledging that the problem was not with Caleb at all. Sloane sat with that for a moment and then said it was true. Helena nodded and said that was the beginning, not the end, and told her to go find out what was actually in those emails before she decided what she was going to do about it. The digital forensics firm Sloane hired worked quickly, and the results were not ambiguous. The messages had originated from a secondary server environment managed by Blackwell Development's IT infrastructure. The signature block attributed to Rowan Structural Safety had been copied character by character from an earlier legitimate contract document. The send timestamps had been adjusted backward through a manual override that left a traceable log entry. The kind of oversight that happens when a person who knows what outcome they want assigns the technical execution to someone who knows how to build a system, but not how to cover every angle of its construction. She then called Maris Holt, who met her at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the Whitmore Crown offices on a Tuesday morning and ordered nothing, which told Sloane more about her anxiety level than any words would have. Maris said that Grant had directed the substitution of the Sentinel vent architecture with a lower-cost alternative produced by a supplier with existing financial ties to Blackwell Development. When Maris had documented her objections and escalated them through the project review process, Grant had communicated to her, through an intermediary, that her professional license was something he had relationships in position to complicate. Maris also confirmed that the electrical insulation materials used in several of the lower mechanical floors had been sourced outside the specification on the approved plan. What Sloane discovered next, working backward through the documentation she could access, was that the electrical contractor for the hotel that had burned 12 years ago, the hotel where Caleb had walked her out of the smoke, had been Blackwell Industrial, the parent company of Grant's current enterprise. The fire investigation report had attributed the cause to aging infrastructure, but a supplementary analysis buried 3 folders deep in the city's archived records suggested the failure point was a panel junction installed contrary to specification. Someone had reviewed the supplementary analysis and filed it without acting on it. Grant had known what Caleb might see in Riverglass Tower. He had also known about the stairwell, about Sloane, and about the probability that if the 2 of them were ever in the same room long enough, the result would be a trust he could not afford. The blind date had not been his doing, but the rest of it had been. Grant scheduled the safety demonstration for a Thursday morning and invited the city's building commissioner, a delegation from the primary insurance consortium, 4 members of the investor group, and 2 journalists who covered commercial real estate. The premise was elegant in its simplicity. If a live demonstration of the building's emergency systems performed without failure in front of regulatory and financial authority, the independent assessment report would be rendered, in practical terms, irrelevant. His confidence in the plan was visible in the way he moved through the building that morning. unhurried, expansive, the body language of a man who had already decided how the day would end. Sloane had known for 36 hours what Grant had built into the system. She had not told him. She called Caleb the night before and told him directly. She needed him at the demonstration, not for the company's benefit, not to repair what had happened at the event, but because there were currently over 200 construction workers in the building on active contract schedules. And if the demonstration was used to push a final occupancy certificate through the approval chain, those workers and then the building's tenants would be living with a system that Grant had dressed up rather than fixed. Caleb said he wasn't interested in rescuing Whitmore Crown's public position. Sloane said she wasn't asking him to. She sent him the complete technical file, every modified schematic, every substituted component list, every altered specification she had been able to compile, and told him to make his own decision about whether the professional obligation was his to act on. He arrived at 7:45 the following morning. Grant's technicians had installed a software layer that would feed the monitoring displays a clean data stream during the demonstration window. Normal pressure readings, correct door position signals, green indicators across every panel. The physical infrastructure underneath it remained what it was. Grant opened the demonstration with remarks about the project's commitment to exceeding safety standards, and the assembled observers nodded in the way of people who expected to be bored by competence. Caleb asked, before the first system test began, whether the demonstration would include a primary power interruption to verify emergency mode performance. Grant said the power interruption was not part of the approved demonstration protocol. Caleb said that was the only test that would reveal whether the system performed as specified in real-world conditions, because the real-world condition that mattered was the one where primary power was gone. He looked at Sloane. She said to proceed. Grant's technician looked at Grant. Grant told him to hold. Sloane told him to continue. The technician cut the primary feed. In the 12 seconds of transition, 7 fire doors on floors 19 through 27 locked in the closed position. The ventilation dampers in the main egress corridor reversed, pulling the demonstration smoke that had been introduced into the test zone toward the occupied stairwell, rather than away from it. 3 emergency lighting panels failed to switch to battery backup because the relay contacts had oxidized from improper storage. A problem not in any design document because it had never been inspected. The monitoring screens, still running Grant's software layer, displayed green on every indicator. Caleb moved through the floor with a portable control unit and manually overrode each zone through the Sentinel Vent Emergency Protocol, restoring egress order within 4 minutes. No one was hurt, the building was not yet occupied, and the demonstration smoke dissipated quickly. But the gap between what the screens showed and what the doors did was visible to every person in the room, and that gap was not the kind that could be smoothed over in remarks or postponed to a later review. Grant said Caleb had interfered with a calibrated system. Caleb brought up the software log on the main display, which showed the installation timestamp of the false data layer alongside the account credentials of the user who had authorized it. Sloane called the emergency board session from the 42nd floor, and the group that assembled in the next 3 hours was a different kind of gathering than the launch event had been, quieter, with the particular attention of people who understood that what was being presented was not a pitch but a record. She walked through the evidence in sequence, the fabricated emails and their server origin, the schematic alterations and their timing relative to the inspection dates, the substituted materials and their sourcing, the software installed to mask the demonstration's true results, and the connection between Blackwell Industrial's electrical work and the hotel fire that had burned the same night. Caleb had walked her out of a stairwell she had never publicly described in detail. Grant interrupted twice. The first time, he suggested Sloane was exercising the authority of a woman who had made a personal decision, and was now constructing a professional justification around it. The second time, he turned to the assembled directors and said that a 9-figure development project should not be derailed by a consulting firm whose largest previous client was a regional school district renovation. Sloan did not respond to either interruption. She moved through the documentation without pausing, and when she finished, the room was quiet in a different way than rooms are quiet when someone has made a poor argument. The city's deputy commissioner of buildings, who had been called in as an observer, spoke next and confirmed that Caleb Rowan was an active member of the Technical Standards Working Group that had revised Chicago's high-rise fire egress code the previous year, and that the Sentinel vent system had been cited in the new code language as the performance benchmark for pressure-balanced evacuation architecture. The lead underwriter from the insurance consortium said that their organization would not extend coverage to Riverglass Tower for occupancy above the 15th floor without his sign-off. Two of the lending institutions represented in the room, separately without apparent coordination, indicated they were pausing disbursement pending investigation of the safety compliance record. The power that Caleb Rowan had walked into that room with was not the power of wealth or title. It was the power of having been correct about something that mattered, documented, and irrefutable in a room full of people who would be professionally accountable if they pretended not to understand it. Sloan used the Whitmore family's voting bloc to formally suspend Grant Blackwell from the board pending investigation by the company's independent audit committee. Grant stood and said she was destroying a project that 3 generations of combined work had made possible, for the benefit of a man who drove a 12-year-old truck and wouldn't know what a carried interest clause was without looking it up. Sloan said the project had survived Grant's involvement, the way a structure survives a bad foundation, by luck and by the efforts of people who caught the problem before it became catastrophic. She said what he had chosen to cut in order to protect his timeline was not a budget line but the mechanism that would have allowed people to get out of the building if it caught fire, and that she was not willing to own that decision on his behalf. Maris Holt submitted, to the audit committee, recorded conversations she had kept over a period of 4 months, stored on a personal device, copied to an attorney, in which Grant's communications to her about the ventilation substitution were documented in his own voice. He was escorted from the building by 2 members of the company's legal team, who were accompanied by city investigators. He said, on his way to the elevator, that she had destroyed everything. She said he had built something that couldn't survive its own design. The press event was held 3 days later, outdoors in front of the Riverglass Tower site, and Sloan stood at the podium without prepared remarks, and without the company's communications director behind her with a printed statement. She said the project had a problem, that the problem was real, and that she had been made aware of the problem by a professional whose assessment she had dismissed without adequate review because she had formed an opinion of him before he had spoken a full sentence. She said she had allowed a version of events to be presented in public that was false and had not corrected it when she had the standing to do so. She listed, in plain terms, the specific decisions she had made that had made Grant Blackwell's scheme easier to execute, dismissing the initial safety report as a delay tactic, accepting a document as evidence without forensic review, and choosing not to intervene when a person's reputation was being damaged in front of a room full of cameras. She announced that Riverglass Tower would be placed on a full construction pause pending a complete systems audit conducted by an independent panel. She also announced that she was declining her annual executive performance bonus and directing the equivalent sum toward a support fund for the subcontractors and small firms whose schedules had been disrupted by the project delays. A category that, she noted, included Rowan Structural Safety, which had completed work it was not ultimately paid for. She met Caleb that evening at Nora's restaurant. She came without her assistant, without a driver, without anyone. He was already at a table near the back, and he had ordered coffee and was reading something on his phone that he put away when she arrived. She placed the watch on the table between them and said the apology she owed him was not about 12 years ago and not about the fire, because that debt was one she had carried the right way. It had made her remember that there were people in the world who acted without calculation. The debt she owed him now was simpler and harder. She had publicly diminished him, and she had done it while knowing, somewhere, that she didn't fully believe what she was allowing to be said. Caleb listened to all of it without interruption. He said the apology was genuine, which he could tell, and that genuine was not the same as sufficient, not yet, and he wasn't going to pretend it was just because it would be easier for both of them. Sloane said she understood and meant it. She handed him a document, a structural reform plan she had drafted with Helena's input over 2 sleepless nights. It established a safety division that reported directly to the board and not to the CEO. It gave any licensed engineer on a Whitmore Crown project the authority to halt construction activity and require review, without the ability of any executive officer to override that authority unilaterally. It provided formal whistleblower protections with legal indemnification. It required public disclosure of any post-approval design modification above a defined materiality threshold. Caleb read it the way he read technical documents, quietly, thoroughly, going back to 2 sections before continuing. He said it was more than a corrective gesture. He said yes to returning to the project, but as an independent technical authority, not a company-affiliated consultant, and with the explicit condition that no conclusion he reached could be altered, delayed, or selectively disclosed by anyone in the organization, including her. She said yes without hesitation. He picked up the watch. He held it for a moment and then set it back in her hand, fingers closing gently around hers. He said she had kept it through the worst years of her life. He said she should keep it until she no longer needed it to remember that she had once been saved. The 6 months that followed were unglamorous and necessary. Riverglass Tower was taken apart at the mechanical level with the methodical care of people who understood that the point was not to finish quickly, but to finish correctly. Maris rebuilt the evacuation architecture from the schematics up, with Caleb's team verifying each phase, and the process was slower than anyone in the investor group would have chosen and more expensive than any of the quarterly projections had accounted for. Whitmore Crown stock spent 2 months in a range that made the financial press attentive and the board meetings tense, and then it stabilized, and then it recovered, not because anything spectacular happened, but because the company did what it said it would do, transparently and on a documented schedule. Sloane began appearing at the construction site on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, arriving before most of the management team and staying on the floor longer than her schedule technically accommodated. She wore a hard hat and sensible shoes and asked questions of the electrical foreman and the mechanical technicians and the structural analysts directly, rather than receiving summaries from her project manager. Caleb noticed this and did not remark on it, but he did begin including her in the morning briefings where the detail-level decisions were made, which was a different kind of acknowledgement. He pushed back on her proposals when her proposals were wrong. She had a habit of optimizing for timeline in moments where timeline was the wrong variable, and when she did it in the engineering briefings, he said so in front of the group, matter-of-factly, and then explained the correct framing. The first time it happened, she had the expression of a person who was deciding something. The 4th time it happened, she had already done the reasoning herself before he could begin. Tessa came to the site once on a Saturday morning as part of a program Caleb had arranged informally through Maris. Sloane was there. She brought a reduced-scale diagram of the building's revised egress system and explained it to Tessa in terms of how the physics worked: pressure differentials, airflow dynamics, the relationship between door mass and hinge placement under emergency load. Tessa asked 3 questions that were better than most of the questions Sloane fielded from journalists. Caleb watched from across the room and said nothing. The building passed its final safety certification 11 days ahead of the revised schedule, with scores across every test category that exceeded the city's minimum standards by a measurable and documented margin. The board moved to offer Caleb a named directorial position with compensation that would have tripled Rowan Structural Safety's annual revenue. He declined the title and the equity and negotiated instead a long-term consulting agreement that gave his firm stable work without placing him inside the organization's chain of command. Sloan signed it the same day. At the opening ceremony, she named him and Maris by name and credited them with having been right when the company's leadership, including herself, had been wrong. The people who had laughed at his jacket at the launch event stood and applauded. He left a card on the lobby table after the ceremony ended, a plain card, handwritten, with the name of a diner 2 neighborhoods north and a time, 8 o'clock. Sloan read it twice, folded it, and put it in her coat pocket. She arrived at 7:58 in a coat she had owned for years and boots that had actual mileage on them, and she came alone, which was something she had not done for an evening out since before she could remember. Caleb was already in a booth near the window in the navy jacket that had been the subject of considerable discussion over the past several months. He had coffee. She sat down and ordered the same. The menu was laminated and featured photographs of the food, which she found oddly reassuring. He said this was the actual first date. The first time, he explained, they had both brought things to the table that didn't belong there. Her assumptions about what kind of man he was, his awareness that she was testing him, and between them a billion-dollar project that had functioned as both battleground and collateral damage. This time, there was none of that. She said she understood and asked whether they could split the check. He smiled, and she understood that he was smiling because she remembered that he had paid his own portion on the night they had met, which meant she had been paying more attention than either of them had admitted at the time. She took the watch out of her coat pocket and set it on the table between the coffee cups. She asked whether he still saw the girl from the stairwell when he looked at her. He said the girl in the stairwell had needed someone to lead her out of a building. He said the woman sitting across from him had walked out of something considerably harder on her own, and that what he saw now was the version of her that had done that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, softly, "Do you recognize me now?" He said, "This time I don't just recognize you. I see you." He extended his hand across the table, palm up, and left the decision to her. She placed her hand in his. The watch sat between them on the table. Its face still cracked, its hands stopped at the hour they had frozen 12 years ago. But between them, at last, time had begun to move again.